Washington's going to see a youth movement in 2025.
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back into another edition of the Locked On Huskies podcast. I'm Roman Tomashoff. That's not Lars Hansen. That's Ben Glassmire of RPM Scouting. So awesome to have him with us here today, as we are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Ben, we got a really fun show coming out all day every day today. We're going to get into some of your film breakdowns. Anybody who follows you on social media or reads anything you've ever written knows you're a big scheme guy, big film guy. We're going to jump into what you've seen from Steve Belichick's scheme so far this season. We're going to talk about some of the younger players that are probably going to make an impact for Washington next season. Lars and I talked about the high-profile guys, DeMond Williams, Decker DeGraff, Powerhouses of the world on yesterday's shows. We're going to get some guys that might be a little bit more under the radar, but we're going to get into some of your favorite freshmen from the 2025 class. And just a reminder to everybody out there who might be tuning in on YouTube, where else you get your podcast, make sure you hit that subscribe button, like the video, make sure you leave us 5-star reviews. It does really help us out a lot. So Ben, let's talk 2025 recruiting class. It's ranked number 18 in the nation right now by 247 Sports. And when you look at this class, who's one guy that jumps off the page and you say, yes, this dude's going to make a huge impact next year?
Yeah. So I know for anyone who knows me or has followed me, tight ends are kind of my sweet spot. I always have a sweet spot for any tight end that comes into teams that I'm following or any NFL draft stuff. So obviously I love Decker DeGraff this year. Was awesome to see him blossom kind of into the player that he's become already, and he's going to be a huge part of the plan going forward. But Baron Naone, a guy I'm so excited about. Like I cannot get. I think when I watched him, I think I texted you like 100 times about him and how excited I am about him coming in. Yeah, and I love the way Jedd Fisch uses tight ends. That's been something that I was really excited about when he came over from Arizona, because he had a guy like Tanner McLaughlin who ended up getting drafted, I think on day 3, I want to say, to the Bengals. And he was super productive, and he was not the most physically talented guy. And now you've seen guys like Decker DeGraff, who is physically talented, already start to star as a freshman. I think if you get a guy like Baron in this scheme and have that ability to go to 12 personnel in a similar way to what they have this year with Kalecki and Decker DeGraff, I think that kind of player can really impact this offense and give the offense another target just because he's so big. I think it's going to be really helpful for DeMond as he kind of, continues to grow, but having that big target to throw to.
So I love where you're going with that. One guy that I need to make sure we bring up in this segment, and I want to make sure we open with him. And it's not just because he's the highest ranked player in this class. It's because everything we've seen from him, whether it be junior film, senior film, whatever it is, Zaydrius Rainey-Sale just looks like a man among boys. It, like in the league he's playing in, like that's one thing. But you look at the way that he's used on both sides of the ball. We see him line up at receiver, at tight end. We just see him find the way, like to get the ball in his hands on both offense and defense. He's somebody who I know you're really excited about when you look at, especially the way that he can be utilized in this Steve Belichick defense. I don't know about you, but I can see him coming in and not necessarily playing the Kamori House role right away, where it feels like Kamori might be a little bit faster, but I can see him playing a role very similar to another guy who's lined up on the edge a lot, in Alfonso Tuputala.
No, I'm totally with you. Yeah, and I'm with you on the Kamori thing. I think Kamori is a super unique athlete, like just a very kind of a strange player when you look at him, but obviously very, very good at what he's doing this year. And I think Rainey-Sale is kind of different, but also similar, like in terms of the way he can impact the defense as a freshman. Where Carson Brunner and Alfonso Tuputala, who you just mentioned, are going to be gone next year. So there's going to be a ton of snaps up for grabs. In terms of just someone is going to have to play linebacker. Like there's no other options. So I think when you have a guy that's so talented like Rainey-Sale, you can't really keep him off the field. It's kind of it's what happened with Kamori this year. They couldn't keep him off the field. He's so talented. He's such a freak athlete. There's no reason to not have him on the field and let him just make plays. I think that's the same for Rainey-Sale. He's the highest ranked player in this class for a reason. He's one of the biggest risers in the country for a reason. He's going to be a huge piece of this defense, even as a freshman, but going forward, he's probably going to be the leader of the defense when you look at it, when you talk, 2-3 years from now.
So I love where you're going with that. I feel like there's another one that we need to mention in that same light, who you talk about playing as a freshman. Because I look at this defensive class and I see a lot of really promising bodies where, you talk linebacker, you can say Donovan Robinson, where Jonathan Epperson's another guy who I really like what he's going to do. I feel like he might be more of a long-term answer at the position, where I think he might need to gain a little bit of weight. I think he's one of the guys who's going to enroll early, so that's going to be really helpful for him.
Yeah.
But like I look along the defensive line and I see a lot of guys that are long-term projects. Where it's like a year, and I don't mean that in a bad way. Just yeah, as guys that are going to develop, like Dominic McCone is somebody who I'm super duper high on. I think he's got a really bright future ahead of him. But I look at cornerback, and I watch Dylan Robinson play, and you and I have debated whether he's going to play offense or defense. I've accepted that he will be a full-time defender, but the more I watch him play, the more I think, is this guy going to, in the same vein as Zaydrius, going to find a way to start by the end of his freshman season?
Yeah, I am with you, and I think we've talked about corners the way this staff scouts corners, especially. I think it's different than what you see from some other teams. They love length. They love tall guys. They love those super lengthy tall guys, and they want to put those guys onto the field. Like they want to get anybody, especially at the cornerback position, where it can be beneficial at times to have some rotation at the position, just in terms of like getting guys snaps inside and out, following receivers, them finding the matchups that they want basically. And I think that Jedd Fisch and his staff and on defense too has been really, really good at that. So I think getting freshman experience at corner is huge, just because it's such a cerebral position. Like you have to be so dialed in to seeing different offensive looks, playing so many different offenses that like they will in the Big Ten. I think getting that experience early on can be super impactful, and they've done a really good job of that, especially this year. So I do think guys like Dylan Robinson can definitely get on the field as a freshman and be super productive.
Right, where this defensive backs class is a lot of fun. I know another guy you're really high on. I'm curious to see how he might get deployed, if at all, really, as a freshman, is Rylan Dillard-Allen, where that's just a name I wanted to make sure we threw in there because especially his speed is so much fun to watch on film. But I want to flip back over to the offensive side here. And as you and I prep for the show, we want to make sure we talk about a bunch of positions where there's one position that I'm really curious to get your take on, and that's wide receiver, where right now there are 4 wide receivers in the class. We'll see what happens with the whole Bryce Underwood flipping to Michigan thing. Probably seems like that might mean Andrew Marshall stay there. Let's see what happens with Donovan Olubade moving forward. That's something I'm really curious about. But from the 4 guys that are committed right now, is there one, for one reason or another, that stands out to you as saying where, we've seen Audric Harris burn his red shirt this season, in that same vein that might just make a jump and do that in 2025?
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard for me to predict just because I feel like this year this year we've seen Denzel Boston, Jeremiah Hunter, Giles Jackson kind of dominate the reps at wide receiver.
Sure.
Like they know what their 3 wide receiver sets are. They know what they want to do with that. And you'll see Hunter leave and Giles will leave as well. So I think you're going to see guys like Keith Reynolds, Audric Harris, Jason Robinson to an extent. Like those guys will step up and kind of eat into some of those snaps when they maybe haven't gotten those reps this year. So it's hard to like pinpoint exactly who you're going to see be like from this freshman class, just because it's kind of like we don't really know who's going to end up, filling those roles. I do think you're going to see like, Chris Lawson, like they're going to get those guys snaps because they are so talented, and bringing up those younger guys to develop along with them on is really important. Like we always talk about how, having a guy like Denzel Boston is so great for a young quarterback just because he's a big target. He's got all of that. But I think bringing along guys like Chris Lawson, Raiden Vines Bright, are so important because those guys are going to grow together. Jedd has talked about Damon being the future of the program. Those receivers need to grow along with Damon, and they need to have a rapport going forward so that when the older guys leave, you're going to have these connections that are going to be established right away when they're stepping into the lineup.
No, I love where you're going with that, Ben. Let's go. Let's take a step back from the recruiting trail and let's look at the roster for maybe some unsung heroes that are going to fill huge roles next season. right after a message from our friends over at Prize Picks, because you can now win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks with as little as 4 correct picks. Prize Picks is the best place to get real money sports action. Join over 10 million users and sign up today. Prize Picks invented the flex play, which means you can still cash out even if your lineup isn't perfect. You can double your money even if one of your picks hits. If you sign up today, you can get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to receive the $50 bonus. It's all guaranteed. Do you think Justin Jefferson will get more than 83.5 yards next week? Lamar Jackson pass for more than 1.5 touchdowns? Cook up a hot takes with your friends and win real money this football season when you and your crew run your game on Prize Picks. I love Prize Picks so much. Usually I like to match it up with some guys that are in my fantasy football lineup. Would be Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, Christian McCaffrey, some of my favorite players like that, because it's so much fun on Prize Picks. You can download the app today and use code LOCKEDONCollege to get $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. Again, that's if you download the app today and use code LOCKEDONCollege to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, run your game. So, Ben, let's jump into the roster here, where you and I, as we prepped before the show to do all this, we were like, ooh, who are some guys who maybe don't have the stats this year, don't have the notoriety per se, that are going to step up big in 2025? And you and I looked at each other and we were like, there's one name we need to start with, and that's Peyton Waters.
Oh, yeah. Peyton Waters is my guy. I love that dude coming in. I honestly thought he would play a little bit bigger of a role this year, just because there was some turnover at safety, but we've seen kind of guys step up. Like Cam Fabs played amazing this year, had a really good year. But Peyton Waters, man, I am so excited for what he can do in Steve Belichick's defense. Really good athlete. I think he's building out his frame really well. I feel like we kind of saw that a little bit this year, just in terms of him putting on good weight, really productive weight, and getting better, earning the trust of the coaching staff. Just like we talked about with corner, safety is a really tough position to play, especially in a defense where Steve Belichick does expect a lot from their safeties. They do a lot of different things, and they need a lot from those safeties. So getting on the field as a freshman or as a young player is a lot more difficult. It's why we've seen a lot of the older guys play this year, especially. But I'm so excited for what he can do in the future, just because he's so talented. He's such a good player. He's got good ball skills. Like they could legitimately turn him into a superstar if he can, kind of blossom like we expect him to.
Ooh, I like where you're going with that. I'm super high on his athleticism, and it's clear how much the coaching staff likes him, because instead of saying, hey, we're going to try to preserve your red shirt, do this and do that, they just said, we're still going to throw you out on special teams every game. We need a playmaker like you in that role. And then all of a sudden next year, when Cam Fab is gone, assuming Cameron Broussard decides to enter the NFL draft as well, because believe he has an extra year of eligibility if he wants it. And so there's going to be a lot of snaps there.
Yeah.
And Peyton Waters is the perfect guy to step up and take over that role. And I feel like we're going to see something similar along the defensive line. And somebody Lars and I didn't get a chance to discuss yesterday is somebody who has certainly stepped into a bigger role this season, and Pro Football Focus seems to really like him. And that's Elinneus Davis.
He's another guy. I'm like hitting all the guys I'm super excited about. Elinneus Davis has been really good in like limited snaps, where and growing into that role, obviously, just because of some of the injuries that we've seen along the defensive line. I really do think that he can be a good player going forward. They're going to need it, just in terms of getting bodies in the middle of that defense. We'll hit on kind of some of the run defense struggles later, but getting guys who are going to fill those snaps and turn into really good players, just because there is some veteran presence there this year, especially, but I think they're looking for a little bit more of upside at at those interior spots, just because they are so critical. And we've seen, with what's changed with some guys that have gone down. So I'm really excited about him going forward too. These are all guys that I'm super excited about.
So I want to stay on that for a minute, because we're going to get to more of just the defensive tackles and everything like that. But it feels like outside of Sebastian Valdez, we haven't seen somebody who can be a true pocket collapser in this defense. And I feel like Elinneus Davis can fill that role. And, Lars and I have talked about the transfer portal and a need to go find somebody like that in the portal, maybe two guys like that. But if there's one on the roster where, obviously there's going to be a question around Jayvon Parker and his torn Achilles. And obviously that sucks. I know you're a huge fan of his as well, but to see how that works out, when we think about guys that as of right now, we know are going to be healthy at the start of the season, or, from knock on wood, let's just do that. Elinneus Davis is at the top of that list.
Yeah.
And I've been so impressed with how he's improved as a pass rusher this year.
Yeah. I think any guy with his length and just overall size, especially the length, like focusing on the length, have automatically have a higher upside as a pass rusher. Especially, you don't see a lot of guys at defensive tackle. It's kind of hard, there's a lot of different archetypes that move into those spots, but Elinneus Davis, just because he's so lengthy and so tall, he does have that ability right off the bat if he can kind of grow into that role to be a pocket collapser, and they really, really do need that. Like you said, it will help out the edge rushers tremendously. It will change the way that defenses attack them from a defensive line perspective and just pass protection in general. So I think getting him to continue to develop, will really help them maybe be more comfortable and not having to go get two guys in the transfer portal that are that kind of type of player if they only have to get one, just because they are so confident that he can step into that role. I think that would be huge, honestly, because then they can kind of move those resources elsewhere.
So I'm really curious to see how this coaching staff wants to do that. Not necessarily in terms of trying to allocate those resources elsewhere. It's more just building a bigger, stronger, faster defensive line. Yeah. Where I kind of look around this roster, and I wrote about it a little bit over on Huskies Wire, and I see, okay, maybe one edge rusher, and you can take a guy who, a lot like they did with Hayden Moore this year at linebacker, where it's a guy who, hey, we really like his long-term projectability. And maybe, you see that on the edge, but at defensive tackle, it's let's go get guys where maybe like in the Sebastian Valdez mold of guys who were really confident with maybe 1 year of eligibility that can just be game wreckers and really just help propel what, let's just say a 7-6 team at the end of the year to a 10-2 team next year. Or that's a prediction that Lars has had. But I want to hand the floor over to you, Ben. Is there anybody where you look at this roster, and any position, doesn't matter, and you say, this is a guy who maybe isn't being talked about enough that's going to be huge next season?
Yeah. Where is the Justin Hylkema love? Where is it?
Oh, yeah, that's your guy.
That is my guy. I loved his film when I watched his film originally. I think that guy has insane upside. And I've seen him on the field. He hasn't played, but obviously, you see him on the field. He looks like an NFL player. Like, he looks like a guy who he's got the body type. On tape, he had the athleticism at that size. I am so excited because they need, if they can have anybody break out at offensive line, it would be huge, especially a tackle. I don't know that he can necessarily maybe play left tackle. It's kind of, I'm curious to see what the coaching staff thinks about that, because I do think he projects a little bit more better as a right tackle. And obviously with, as a party is there now. So I'm a little bit curious to see what where the coaching staff's view of him is, just because there are some younger bodies at offensive line. So I'm curious to see, going into next year, if he's going to get a real shot to win one of those tackle jobs, or he's a little bit tall to be a guard. So I don't really know that that's super realistic. But yeah, I love that dude, and I want him to be a star.
So I'm glad that's who you mentioned, because I wanted to stick along the offensive line. And obviously, we kind of omitted Paki Finau from this conversation because we know that he's somebody who this coaching staff just absolutely adores and might step into a bigger role next year, depending on, what happens in the transfer portal. If he's obviously able to just continue to add weight and performs really well at spring practice, who knows? We'll see what happens at just there. But one guy that I really look at, and I say, I know this coaching staff is really high on him because we saw it throughout fall camp, is Michael Watkins, where that's a guy who you look at just the way he moves on film and you say, oh, this dude has a really, really high ceiling.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one too. One thing that was big on his film was just his ability to pull across the formation from that guard spot and be a lead blocker. That's important to this offense. That's something that they want. And I don't think you've really seen that very much this year, just because of the personnel that they've had on those interior spots. They don't necessarily have the kind of athlete that you need to be super confident running that kind of play with a guy as your lead blocker like that. So I do think that will give him an edge to potentially win a guard spot, or, be in the running at least to do that. So I'm totally with you there. I'm really excited about him. I feel like there's just a lot of, obviously, offensive line not a strength this year, but there is a lot to be excited about just because of guys like Paki, Hylkema, and Watkins. And there's other guys too. Like there is talent there. It's just not, we just haven't seen it yet.
Right. You did a fantastic job of just saying, hey, these are the guys we're talking about because, yesterday Lars and I talked about Landon Hatchett, Kaylee Tafai, we'll see what happens with Maximus McCree, those sort of guys where it all blends together really nicely, where that's the position that, it is what it is this season. But I look at it in 2025 and I say, if there's one position that I really expect to make a giant step forward, it's along the offensive line. So, and especially with just the way everything shapes up next year in terms of the schedule, I really like where it's going. I'm just curious to see what happens. But Ben, let's jump into Steve Belichick's scheme because I know there's a lot that you love on film. Right after a message from our friends over at ZBiotics, because ZBiotics pre-alcohol probiotic drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. Pre-alcohol produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make ZBiotics your first drink of the night. Drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. Here's how to use it. Step 1, drink pre-alcohol. For best results, make pre-alcohol your first drink of the night. Step 2, drink responsibly. Pace yourself, hydrate, and get a good night's sleep. Step 3, enjoy tomorrow. Wake up feeling refreshed and ready to take on the day. Go to zbiotics.com/LockedOnCollege to learn more and get 15% off your first order when you use Locked On College. And check out ZBiotics is backed with 100% money back guarantee. So if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/LockedOnCollege and use the code LockedOnCollege at checkout for 15% off. We've also got a message from our good friends over at FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers can bet $5 to get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. And my favorite long-term future bet right now is the Lions to come out of the NFC. They're just looking so strong. I really don't know who's going to stop them, especially the way, San Francisco looks. The Eagles might be the only other team that I look at and say, we'll see. But the Lions, I love them right now. You should go check out all those odds and more over on FanDuel. All right, Ben, let's talk tape. Lars and I got a question the other day that was, hey, why aren't you guys a little more critical of the run defense? And so when we got an opportunity to get you in here to talk about it, I felt like this was a question that was best suited for you because of just the way you've been able to look at the scheme, because I don't necessarily think it's a scheme issue. I think it's they don't have the bodies at defensive tackle yet, which is why we wanted to spend so much time talking about that.
Yeah, I agree. My biggest answer to that question is Jayvon Parker. That is my answer to that question. I think I haven't looked at the stats, so I can't verify this with any numbers or anything, but just based on what I've seen, the pre-Jayvon Parker injury versus post-Jayvon Parker injury are very different run defenses.
I agree. And sorry, one other thing I want to make sure we get in there is he's not the only one who and this is something Jedd Fisch has talked about, is another person who's missed a significant amount of time since then is Zach Durfee.
100%. It's both of them. It really is. But I think both those guys are so stout in run defense, and they're so good at diagnosing quickly and seeing what's in front of them, shedding blocks. They were such a critical piece of what Steve Belichick wanted to do. Obviously going into the Big Ten, where there is a little bit more of an emphasis on runs, especially you look at games like Iowa. I know that's probably gets pointed to number one just because Caleb Johnson absolutely ran all over the Huskies in that game. And I think that's your exhibit one of what the loss of Zach Durfee and Jayvon Parker looks like, because you don't have those stout presence, those important presences on your defensive line to kind of anchor the run defense so that you're not so dependent on guys who that may not be their strength. But when I look at Jayvon Parker, I think I thought of him way more as a pass rusher when he started and when he was so dominant earlier on in his career. But the development this year, that before his injury, that he had shown as a run defender was unbelievable. Because I was fully in on him being like a eventual top, whatever you want to say, day 2, potentially round 1 pick, just because of his upside as a pass rusher, and that's what the NFL does value at those positions. But being able to pair that pass rushing ability with the ability that he showed as a run defender made him one of the best players on the defense. And that loss, you can't really replace that. because you can try to replace that in the aggregate with different players playing those certain roles, but there's really no one else that can step up in that spot and be the pass rusher that he was and the run defender that he was, and what that can do for the defenses and the way the offenses have to scheme against a player like that. So I don't think it's a scheme issue. I'm really not worried about Steve Belichick's defense in terms of run defense, especially going into next year. It's just that loss threw everything out of whack, and it kind of ruined the plan that they seem to have going into this year.
Yeah, absolutely. Where we saw, a kind of a gradual lead up to him getting all that playing time in the Rutgers game where, after missing week 1, it just kind of built up. And then, because we saw him really have a breakout performance in that game as well. So that just made it such a big loss. I love where you're going with that. So let's work from the inside out. We talked edge rusher a little bit with Durfee where, I love just this edge rushers room as a whole. I think that's my favorite room right now on this defense. It's so deep. It's so talented. I feel like we're going to see just more of that with most of these guys coming back for next season as well. But let's get to the linebackers because we do so many of these shows. I can't remember if we have you on since the season started, but one of the most interesting things we've seen this year is the breakout of Alfonso Tuputala. And a lot of that is because of the different ways that he's been utilized. And the more I look at that, the more I get excited about some of the guys that they're bringing in. Obviously, we talked about Zaydrius, Rainey-Sale. And I just say, this just feels like not necessarily the future of the defense, but just something that you can use to get these really athletic, impactful linebackers just in other ways to make an impact on the game.
For sure. I think that's one thing that Steve Belichick, we're talking about his scheme, that's he's done really well this year. That the previous coaching staff, I really don't think did a very good job of. We saw their struggles as a defensive team, and I think a lot of that just started with the previous coaching staff had a way that they viewed linebackers and the way that they viewed defensive linemen, and that they were going to pigeonhole guys into the role that they wanted. Whereas I think Steve Belichick has taken the opposite approach where he's saying, okay, I'm going to take my defense and I'm going to take the players that we have and I'm going to mold my defense around the players that we have. You look at a guy like Alfonso Tuputala, his role isn't really going to be like a Mike linebacker. He's not that type of player. And that's okay. But you can't pigeonhole him into making him do that. So I think giving him the snaps that he's gotten along the edge has just made him a more complete player that can actually impact the defense in the ways that he's best at. And that's why he's broken out this year, just because Steve Belichick puts him in the best positions to be successful, instead of saying, okay, we're going to put you in this position and then just like go figure it out. I think that he's really taken the approach that's a lot better and honestly makes players more excited to play in the defense. I think you've seen a little bit of like, I don't want to say attitude transformation because I feel like that comes off as really negative, but you've seen him just kind of play with more fire, with more effort, with, the motor that we saw from him previously has kind of come back to life a little bit. And he's just been a monster this year. So I think that's really important to note in just the way that Steve Belichick does look at the players that he's putting into his defense.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I feel like, if you'd ask any linebacker, like, hey, what's your favorite thing to do? It's obviously just make plays however possible. And he's been in a great position to do that because I don't know about you, but the thing that gets me most excited about Steve Belichick's defense is that zero down lineman look that he likes to go to on third and long. It just feels like his go-to pass rush set at this point in time. But it's one of those things where you look at who's out there, whether it be Voit Tanufi or Deshaun Lynch at the zero. And then you got, inside linebackers lined up out there, whether it be Isaiah Ward, Lance Holtzclaw, Zach Durfee, whoever it is, still out there on the edge. It's just, this feels like exactly what these guys want to be doing, which is just finding ways to utilize their strengths to get after the quarterback.
Yeah, I love that. That front is my favorite. I want to say it's called like a NASCAR front. That's kind of the term that's used for it. And like you mentioned, Voit Tanufi, that's like my favorite. That's my favorite way that he gets used. I think that's another guy I definitely wanted to highlight on the defensive line because he's had a huge year. And he hasn't had a huge year, and we talk about being pigeonholed into roles, was very, very, very pigeonholed into roles under the previous coaching staff, and not at all a player that you can pigeonhole. It just doesn't work for his skill set because he's just such a kind of bizarre player, like hybrid interior edge rusher. But they've used him so well this year, and in that front that Steve Belichick uses, he usually he'll be like a stand-up rusher over the A gap, which is I think is such a cool usage for him. In just his style, the way he plays, he can just kind of be a menace in that role.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say, just like I like the term menace better than what I was going to use, because I was going to say if he should have his own position just called disruptor, but menace is way more fun. So I think I'm just going to use that with him from now on. But before we get out of here, Ben, we got to talk about the secondary, because it's not number 1 in the country anymore in terms of yards allowed per game, but it's still in the top 10. And with a lot of the same pieces, obviously Ephesians Prysock being a new one, but you look at what it was compared to where it was last year, there's still a lot of the same pieces back there that are making it happen. What's different?
It's technique. That is the biggest difference this year. I like the scheme. Obviously, I think it's great. I think the way that they use those guys, awesome. But the emphasis on playing sound, disciplined coverage has been light years ahead of where it previously was. I think you can see it just in the way that Jordan Shaw and Thaddeus Dixon, Prysock to an extent, but you kind of already knew what he was, and he was already with, he came with Jedd Fisch, obviously. But I just think you've seen them play with a lot of fire, because you still want that from their secondary. They still play that way like they did last year, but you've just seen them channeling that fire into on-field play rather than, making mistakes, whether that's, being too handsy, getting up in guys before the balls gets there. I think you've just seen guys develop way faster than kind of what we expected from last year, just because we kind of thought we knew what these guys were, and then they've been put into positions where they've been coached up really well on here's what you're going to do in these situations. They've been really good at tackling, which I think was huge too. But yeah, I just emphasize technique, and you can clearly see that was a huge emphasis when the defensive staff came in this offseason.
Ben, thank you so much for taking the time to jump on with us today. Thank you to all the videos tuning in. We really do appreciate your support. We got so much more fun stuff coming like this throughout the season, the off season. So make sure you tune in wherever you get your podcast. Make sure to subscribe, whether it's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. We're there. We're everywhere. We're updating the channel with new content every single day. So make sure you click that like button, click that little bell, so you never miss when we post new video. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, drop them right down below in the comment section. And if you're audio only, please leave us 5-star reviews. It does help us out a lot. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you on Monday.